Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the deep dive where we work through important texts and ideas to give you a clear, structured look at the principles that have shaped Christian thought. Today, we're spending our time with, well, a giant of the First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards. We're going to be dissecting his 1732 sermon, Christian Charity, or the Duty of Charity to the Poor, Explained and Enforced. And our mission for this is very specific. A listener shared this text because they really wanted to understand Edwards' view on charity, not as, some optional good deed, but as an indispensable binding duty. We're not just going to summarize what he said. We want to trace his logic, step by step, to find the theological steel behind his arguments.
Right, and setting the stage here is critical. This is Edwards the pastor, not primarily Edwards the philosopher. This is practical theology, and it's anchored firmly in his Westminster tradition. For him, the moral law is binding on all people at all times. So the command to love your neighbor as yourself isn't a suggestion. Charity is just the practical application of that moral law, and he's going to argue it's enforced with even greater weight under the gospel.
And he starts this whole sermon by taking his congregation right to the source text.
He does. He opens with Deuteronomy 15, verses 7 through 11. And it's a striking passage. You can hear the urgency and the repetition. It really reveals the heart condition God demands.
Let's listen to just how intense this instruction from God is as he urges Israel to fight against their own natural desire to hoard.
If there be among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within any of thy gates in thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart, nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother, but thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need in that which he wanteth. Beware that there be not a thought in thy wicked heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of release, is at hand, and thine eye be evil against thy poor brother, and thou givest him not, and he cry unto the Lord against thee, and it be sin unto thee. Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved when thou givest unto him. Because that for this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thy works, and in all that thou puttest thine hand unto. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, and to thy needy in thy land.
Wow. And the moment Edwards finishes reading that, he just drops the hammer. He doesn't start with a gentle suggestion.
No, he begins with a doctrine. He states it plainly. It is an absolute and indispensable duty of God's people to give bountifully and willingly for the supply of the wants of the needy.
That word, indispensable, that's the key, isn't it? It means it's non-negotiable.
Exactly. He's pushing back against any idea that giving is just for the rich, or that it's just, a nice thing to do. So he structures this first section by clarifying three things.
Okay. What are they?
Who you give to, how much you give, and what the condition of your heart has to be when you give.
All right, let's start with the scope. Who is this poor brother from Deuteronomy? You can easily argue that just means a fellow Israelite.
And that's the first fence he tears down. He argues that thy poor brother is essentially synonymous with the New Testament idea of neighbor. He says, yes, the immediate context is Israel, but the moral logic demands we apply it more broadly. And he uses the Old Testament itself to prove it. He points to Leviticus 25.35, which commands relief for the stranger and the sojourner. So God's people were always obligated to help those outside their immediate tribe or nation.
So even within the Old Covenant, the obligation crossed boundaries. And of course, Edwards is writing in the 1700s, so he brings Christ's teaching into it.
He has to. He takes a direct shot at that narrow, restricted view that the Pharisees had, where neighbor only meant one of their own people.
And he says Christ himself condemned that view.
Explicitly. He points his listeners right to the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan, who was an enemy of the Jews, proved he was the true neighbor because he was the one who actually showed mercy to the man in need.
That would have been a radical point for his congregation in New England, just like it was for the Jews in the first century.
Absolutely. Edwards is saying it doesn't matter if it's a traveler, someone from a different colony, even someone from a denomination you have a feud with. If they are in want, they're your neighbor. Your hand must be open.
So the scope is universal. Okay, moving from who to how much. Edwards is just as demanding here. It's not enough to give something.
No. The text says, thou shalt open thine hand wide. And for Edwards, this means the gift must be sufficient for his need.
He expands on that phrase, doesn't he? He sets a really high social standard.
He does. He says there ought to be none suffered to live in pinching want among the visible people of God.
Pinching want. That's a powerful phrase. It suggests something more than just being hungry for a day.
It does. I mean, think about 1732 New England. Pinching want is the lack of firewood in a brutal winter. It's not being able to afford medicine for a sick child. It's not having proper clothes to go to work or to worship.
So Christian charity isn't just about preventing starvation.
No, it's about providing enough stability to prevent that kind of recurring destitution and suffering in the community. Now, of course, he's quick to add the biblical exceptions for idleness or prodigality.
Right, for those who won't work or just waste what they're given.
But the general rule stands. If someone is genuinely in need, they must be relieved, and relieved adequately.
I want to pause on something in the source text because it's a bit confusing. It says, "You shall surely lure him sufficient for his need." Lending implies getting paid back.
That's a really important clarification he makes. Edwards acknowledges the Old Testament had laws for both loans and for outright gifts. But he explains that in Scripture, especially when talking about charity to the poor who can't possibly repay, the word lend is often used to mean giving, with no expectation of getting it back.
Does he give a clear biblical example for that reading?
He points right to Jesus' teaching in Luke 6:35. Do good and lend, hoping for nothing again.
So under the gospel, the transaction is functionally a gift.
Exactly. It's an act of release, a complete ungrudged provision for a brother's basic needs.
Okay, so the hand must be open wide, giving sufficiently. Now for the third point, which is the heart. We have to give willingly.
And for Edwards, the disposition of the heart is everything. If you give the gift, but you do it reluctantly with a sense of resentment,
Then the act is basically worthless to God.
it's rejected by God, even if the person gets the material relief. It has to be done freely and without grudging.
He quotes 2 Corinthians here, right?
God loves a cheerful giver. If your heart is grieved when your hand opens, the action has no real spiritual merit. It's not a tax. It has to be a joyful expression of love.
And this is where he gets into the wicked heart objections. The Deuteronomy passage warns against even the thought of reluctance.
It does. And the specific historical objection it mentions gives us a really fascinating look into their economy. The law warned people not to hold back because the 7th year, the year of release, was coming up.
Right. Can you unpack that? Why was that 7th year such a powerful incentive to be stingy?
Well, imagine you're an Israelite farmer. It's year 6 of the 7-year cycle. Your neighbor is in dire straits and needs a big loan of grain to survive until the next harvest. The law says that at the start of year 7, all debts between Israelites are canceled, forgiven, wiped clean.
So if you give that loan now, just a few months before the year of release,
You're going to lose it all. It's a guaranteed financial loss. So the temptation, that internal covetous calculation, is to shut your hand, to let your eye be evil against thy poor brother.
and God is warning them that even thinking that way is a sin.
It's a sin that cries out to heaven. Because allowing the fear of loss to overcome the duty to relieve need shows a complete lack of trust in God's provision.
That reframes the whole thing. The sin isn't just in the action, it's in the thought process that puts personal wealth above a neighbor's survival.
And with that duty defined, Edwards then moves into his second section and just ratchets up the gravity of it all.
He says charity isn't just a commendable thing.
No, it's a bounden duty. He puts it on the same level as the most critical religious acts, like prayer or public worship. To neglect it brings great guilt.
He seems to be pushing back against the tendency to prioritize, the big visible acts of worship over the quiet, unseen acts of mercy.
He is. He calls it one of the weightier matters of the law. And he's citing Jesus in Matthew 23 here. Christ condemns the Pharisees for tithing their garden herbs while neglecting judgment, mercy, and faith.
So, for Edwards, charity is fundamentally a moral duty, not a ceremonial one. Let's unpack that distinction. What does it mean for it to be part of the moral law in his Reformed tradition?
Okay, so in the Westminster framework, you have the law of God divided into 3 parts: moral, ceremonial, and judicial.
Right.
Ceremonial law, like temple sacrifices, that all pointed to Christ, and it ceased with his coming. The judicial law governed the nation of Israel. But the moral law, which is summarized in the 10 Commandments and the command to love God and neighbor, that's perpetually binding on everyone, always.
So by putting charity under the moral law, he's making it inescapable.
Exactly. It's the active expression of loving your neighbor as yourself. If you neglect it, you're not just failing a church program. You are transgressing God's eternal rule of righteousness.
And he even says it's superior to outward ordinances, using that quote from Hosea, "I desired mercy and not sacrifice."
Right. If you have a choice between an act of worship and an act of mercy, mercy takes precedence. Flawless church attendance means nothing to God if your heart is closed to your suffering neighbor.
He also brings in James 1.27, defining pure religion as visiting the fatherless and widows in their affliction.
Which basically makes charity a litmus test for genuine faith. If you claim to be religious, but your life shows no active compassion for the helpless, your claim is hollow.
So after establishing this incredible moral weight, Edwards then asks why. Why does God insist on this so heavily? And his first answer is about the reasonableness of it, just based on how we're made.
He gives two really powerful arguments here. The first is the image of God. We're all made in God's image. We're all of one blood.
We share the same needs, the same aversion to misery.
Right. We're allied by nature. So because we're united in this common humanity, it's just fundamentally reasonable that we should love our neighbor and seek their relief.
We aren't meant to be isolated individuals.
No, and that's his second reason. Societal necessity. Mankind was made to subsist by society, to function like the members of a body.
So if one part of the body is in pain, the whole body suffers.
It does. And he uses some really strong language here. He says a selfish, niggardly spirit is more suitable for wolves and other beasts of prey than for human beings. To refuse to help is to betray the very purpose of human community.
So the obligation is baked into creation itself. But then he takes it a step further. He argues this obligation is magnified, exponentially, under the gospel.
This is the Christological foundation, and it's the most powerful part of the sermon, I think. He forces us to look at Christ's example from 2 Corinthians 8.9.
For ye know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor.
That ye through his poverty might be rich. The comparison is just devastating. Christ, who was rich with all the glory of heaven, became poor, even to the point of death.
And he did it for us, who Edwards calls vile wretches, to make us spiritually rich.
And Edwards just presses that point. He asks, how unsuitable is it for people who live only by kindness, whose entire hope depends on unmerited mercy, to then be unkind and tight-fisted themselves?
He says if Christ had made objections to dying for us the way we make objections to giving away $5,
we would all be eternally lost. Christ's extravagant, self-denying generosity becomes the new standard for his people.
So our charity isn't based on whether the recipient deserves it. It's a reflection of the giver, who gave to us when we were totally undeserving.
And this redemption creates an even closer bond than just our shared humanity. Now we're children of God, brethren, one body in Christ.
He brings in 1 Corinthians 12 here, right? We're all members of one body.
Yes. If one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. To let a member of Christ's body live in want is like a form of self-mutilation. It's refusing to help yourself.
So after laying all that out, he turns it directly on the listener. He demands self-examination.
He asks them straight up, have you neglected this duty? Have you given, but grudgingly? Have you looked at the gift as a loss, a matter of covetousness?
And he connects this individual failure to the sin of Sodom.
He does. He reminds them of Ezekiel 16.49, that Sodom's sin wasn't just its infamous immorality. It was pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy.
Wow. So for Edwards, failing to help the poor wasn't just a side issue for Sodom. It was a defining characteristic of their wickedness.
And he applies that right to his own congregation, saying he's concerned that much guilt for this neglect lies upon their land, despite all their outward piety. Charity is the barometer of their spiritual health.
Okay, so as we move into section 3, Edwards shifts his argument from duty and relationship to ownership and accountability. This is a core Reformed principle.
It is, and it's a direct challenge to the kind of rising individualism of his time. He makes it crystal clear, your possessions are not your own.
You only have a subordinate right.
That's the phrase he uses. Our money, our land, our goods, it's all been lent to us by God, who is the ultimate owner of everything.
So even if you worked hard for it, even if your name is on the deed, you're not the true proprietor.
No, because where do you get the health to work? The intelligence, the opportunity, the stable society to do business in. It all comes from God's hand. He is the owner. We are merely the managers.
This is the stewardship analogy.
Exactly, from 1 Peter. We are stewards, not proprietors. And a steward's job is to use the master's goods, to care for the master's family, not to enrich himself.
And he paints this really vivid picture of the unfaithful steward who hoards the goods for himself while the rest of the master's household is suffering.
He says that steward is guilty of robbing his master and embezzling his substance.
That reframes everything. If I think I'm the owner, giving is generosity. If I know I'm a steward, withholding is theft.
Theft from the master. And that means we will all have to give an account of our stewardship. What will we say to the master when he returns if we hoarded his goods for ourselves while his children went without?
This leads right into his next major point, which is just as staggering.
That giving to the poor is giving to Christ himself.
God has made the needy his designated receivers.
He has. Edwards quotes Proverbs 19:17. He that hath pity on the poor lendeth to the Lord. You're not just giving to a person. You're entering into a transaction with God Almighty.
And he backs this up with the ultimate proof text, the judgment scene in Matthew 25.
Yes. The connection Christ makes is direct and inescapable. Inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me.
It's not just that Christ approves of the act.
No, he receives the act. So withholding help is denying Christ himself. If Christ stood before you hungry, you'd feed him. Edward's point is that Christ is standing before you in the person of your needy brother.
He even reminds them that Christ himself needed charity when he was on earth.
He does, pointing to Luke 8, where women ministered to Jesus of their substance. The God-man himself was sustained by the gifts of others.
And his argument is that Christ still needs charity today.
In many of his members. When a Christian is in want, Christ, who is united to them, suffers want with them. When they are relieved, he is relieved in them.
It's a powerful argument, and this leads Edwards to acknowledge that this duty is, well, it's hard.
It's incredibly difficult. It runs against our corrupt nature, our selfishness, our covetousness. It requires real self-denial.
In a world that prizes accumulation, being asked to actively give away your resources it's radical.
It is. But Edwards uses that very difficulty as a test. To be a real disciple requires difficult duties. Deny yourself. Take up your cross. If you think you're going to get to heaven without any sacrifice, you have, as he says, a wrong notion of things. The difficulty is part of the point.
So having laid out the duty, the ownership, and the cost, he then pivots to the consequences. This is what you call the divine standard of reciprocity.
Yes. God will deal with us exactly as we deal with others. The standard is consistent.
Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy.
That's the promise. But the warning is just as absolute. He shall have judgment without mercy that hath showed no mercy. The standard you apply to your neighbor is the standard God will apply to you.
This just blows up the idea that you can have a strong faith and a closed fist.
It does. He goes back to James again. That faith without works of mercy is dead. It's hypocrisy to say to someone, be warmed and filled, and then not give them the coat or the food they need.
So for Edwards, charitable action isn't what earns your salvation.
Not at all. But it is the necessary, inevitable fruit of genuine, saving faith. It's the proof.
He says it's an essential characteristic of a godly person.
Right. Psalm 37 says of the righteous man, he is ever merciful and lendeth. It's part of his defining character, which means your charity is a trial of your sincerity.
1 John 3. If you see your brother in need and shut up your compassion, how dwelleth the love of God in him?
It's a stark equation. An uncharitable person, no matter how pious they look on Sunday, demonstrates they have no real love for God because they don't reflect God's character towards his children.
Okay, so that's the peril. But then Edwards moves to the promise, the encouragement. He says you are no loser by giving.
This is his big argument for trusting providence over your savings account. He quotes Acts 20:35. It is more blessed to give than to receive.
He reframes the entire transaction. What you give isn't lost.
It's lent to the Lord, who promises to repay you, not just what you gave, but with a great increase. He quotes Luke 6:38, good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over.
God's repayment isn't just one-to-one, it's abundant.
It transforms charity from an expense into a heavenly investment.
Yeah.
You're laying up treasure in heaven in bags that wax not old.
And that's a much safer investment.
Infinitely safer. In heaven, no thief approacheth nor moth corrupts. You're not throwing it away, you're putting it in God's hands, and he guarantees both its safety and its increase.
This leads to that great analogy of sowing seed.
Yes, from Ecclesiastes and 2 Corinthians, a farmer doesn't think his seed is lost when he throws it in the ground. He expects a harvest.
And Edwards says giving to the poor is just as likely to bring an increase as sowing seed in a field.
He says it demonstrates faith, and that faith is what gains the blessings of God's covenant. But it requires you to ignore the risks.
Right. A farmer has to ignore the possibility of a drought or pests.
And Edwards says we have to ignore the winds and the clouds, all the reasons to be fearful and wait for a safer time. If you wait for the perfect conditions, you'll never sow and you'll never reap.
So a lack of charity is really a lack of faith in God's governance of the world.
That's it, exactly. And he addresses that financial fear head on. He says God's ability to repay us is immediate and often invisible.
Our success or failure depends entirely on providence.
Right? God can take away your wealth through a sudden illness, a fire, a business deal that goes sour, or he can increase it through good health, favorable weather, and unexpected opportunity.
He asks, doesn't one single act of providence in a year often change your financial situation more than everything you gave to the poor combined?
So if you really believe God's promise to bless you, holding back out of fear is just illogical. It's doubting that God is in control.
And if we refuse to trust and we do hold back, there's a consequence.
There's the curse for uncharitableness. Proverbs 28:27 says, "He that hideth his eyes shall have many a curse."
And he has a very specific definition for hiding the eyes.
The uncharitable person is always at a loss for objects. They're willfully blind. They don't want to know about the need because if they knew, they'd feel obligated. So they find reasons to doubt every story, to question every need.
But the liberal person is quick-sighted.
They see needs everywhere because their heart is already open to helping. The curse is that this hoarding, which is meant to make them rich, actually tends toward poverty because it puts them at odds with God's providential government.
And before he gets to the final objections, he offers one last argument based on future security: the uncertainty of life.
Right. You don't know what evil shall be upon earth, we focus on today, but he forces us to think about old age or calamity or the future of our children.
He says your kindness now is laying up against such a time.
The charity you give is the bread God keeps for you against the day you need it most. It's the best inheritance you can leave your children. He quotes Psalm 37, "I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. He is ever merciful and lendeth, and his seed is blessed."
But for the uncharitable,
The threat is that when they are in distress, they'll be left helpless. Proverbs 21:13, "Whoso stoppeth his ears at the cry of the poor, he shall cry himself and not be heard."
okay, now we get to the part the listener really wanted to understand. The steel of his theology, where he just dismantles all the common excuses.
This is where he gets incredibly practical. The first objection is a theological one, from someone worried about their own spiritual state, the unregenerate state. I'm in a natural condition. If I give, I'd just be trying to earn my way to heaven.
That's a real concern in Reformed circles, right? The danger of making a righteousness out of your good works.
It is, but Edwards dismisses it completely. He says you could make that objection against any religious duty: prayer, worship, being honest. It's basically telling God that his command to obey isn't the right path for you.
He says if you wait until your motives are perfectly pure, you'll never do anything.
Exactly. He reminds them that Daniel told the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar to seek mercy by showing mercy to the poor. The command to obey a moral duty stands regardless of your spiritual state. In fact, obedience is often the path God uses to bring you to saving faith.
All right, the next one is the big one, the most common financial excuse. Objection 2. Not sufficient for myself. I have nothing to spare.
Ah, yes. The "I can't afford it" argument, Edwards is. Well, he's pretty ruthless with that one.
He challenges the very definition of spare, doesn't he?
He says almost no one will ever feel like they have more than they desire. If we wait until giving costs us nothing, we'll never give. He says we must be willing to suffer a little bit ourselves if a neighbor's need is much greater than our own.
That's what bearing one another's burdens actually means.
If it's not a burden to you, you're not bearing one. He brings up the two coats rule from Luke. You give even when you don't have a massive surplus.
And he uses the example of the Macedonians.
From 2 Corinthians. They gave liberally, even out of their deep poverty, so even the poor might be obliged to give. And then he circles back to the providence argument. This objection just reveals a lack of faith. Giving is sowing seed. It's the path to increase, not to poverty.
Okay, objection 3 shifts the goalposts on what counts as need, not in extremity. They can live, they're suffering, but they're not starving to death.
And he just rejects that as an unbrotherly standard. Do you only help your own brother when he has a compound fracture? No. You sympathize with any difficulty he's having.
We're supposed to be afflicted in our neighbor's affliction.
And since we all seek relief for our own minor hardships, not just for life-threatening emergencies, loving our neighbor as ourselves means we have to seek relief for theirs too. Hardship is a sufficient reason. We don't have to wait for a catastrophe.
Objection 4 is a huge one for our human nature. The ill sort of person. He's ungrateful, he has a bad attitude, he treated me badly last year.
This is where Edwards forces total submission to the gospel. And his answer is an absolute yes, you are still obligated.
Why?
Because of two higher laws. First, love your neighbor, which Christ proved applies even to your enemy. And second, the new commandment. Love one another as Christ loved us.
And how did Christ love us?
He loved us when we were hateful, undeserving enemies who had treated him ill. We were the ill sort of person. So we have to show that same kind of love, even to those who are ungrateful or have a bad temper. Their lack of merit doesn't cancel our obligation.
Wow. Okay, objection 5 is about who has to initiate. Must they ask? I'm not obliged until they come and beg.
Edwards calls that a passive, uncharitable excuse. He says it's far more kind to inquire into someone's circumstances and help them before you force them to go through the humiliation of begging.
The liberal person is proactive.
Yes, from Isaiah, he devises liberal things. He's looking for ways to help. You wouldn't make your own brother beg. You'd see his need and step in.
Objection 6 is the moral blame argument. Fault of the poor. He brought this on himself through laziness or wasting his money.
Edwards gives a four-part answer to this one. First, if their poverty is due to a lack of ability or just poor judgment, that's a misfortune, not a crime. We should be thankful for our own abilities and help them.
What if it was just imprudence, not malice?
Then refusing to help is treating their mistake like an unpardonable crime, which is totally contrary to the gospel's call for forgiveness.
And what if it really was a vicious habit, but they've stopped?
If they show repentance, the gospel requires forgiveness. Their past fault is not a permanent bar to receiving help.
But the final point is the most critical. What if the person continues in their vice, but they have a family?
Then we are still obliged to show charity to their innocent families, the wife and children. Edwards says the command to help is positive, and it's better to risk wasting some money on the guilty person than to let innocent people suffer.
The final objection feels very modern. Government provision. The law takes care of the poor through taxes. Private charity isn't necessary.
He says that rests on two false assumptions. First, that the law actually relieves everyone who is a true object of charity. He says the law usually only provides for bare subsistence for those in extremity.
It's not designed to meet the higher Christian standard of sufficient relief.
No. And the second false assumption is that the government is actually doing its job perfectly, that no one is falling through the cracks.
Which is never true.
Right. And Edwards says even if the town has a duty, if the town fails in its duty, the obligation falls right back on us, the individual neighbor.
He uses the Samaritan analogy one last time.
The Samaritan was obliged to help, even though the robbers were to blame, and the Jewish authorities should have been there. If your neighbor is suffering because of someone else's neglect, that doesn't excuse you. The duty is always personal and active.
That's an incredible breakdown of the logic.
So to put it all together, for Edwards, charity isn't about feeling generous. It's a binding, absolute duty. And it's rooted in two non-negotiable truths.
The first being God's absolute ownership of everything.
Which makes us stewards who are accountable for how we use his resources. And second, the immeasurable grace Christ showed us, which obligates us to mirror that same costly love to everyone, even our enemies.
What's so powerful about Edwards is how he recontextualizes all our economic fears into a spiritual problem. A closed hand isn't a sign of prudence, it's a sign of doubt.
Right. It's a failure of faith.
He compares that uncharitable heart to the man from Ecclesiastes. He that observeth the winds shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. What Edwards teaches is that a lack of charity is less a financial decision and more a lack of faith in God's promises and his control over the world. So a final thought for you to consider is this. What wind or cloud are you observing today? What fear or excuse are you raising from your own heart that keeps your hand closed from your needy brother? Something to think about.